Alright, so most of you probably know by now that this channel talks a lot about game design. And you know what? That's great, I love talking about game design. But there's always been a bunch of game design tips that I think are really important but aren't deep enough for me to dedicate an entire 15-minute video to them. So that's exactly what this video is gonna be. Random unassorted game design tips that you should probably know if you're a game developer. Although before I start, I need to put out a few important disclaimers. First off, while I do love all of the thought and research that goes into designing a game, I have to admit that I've never actually made a full-scale game before. I've only ever made small ones that took anywhere from a few days to make to just an hour, most of which were in Pygame. If you listen to my voice and try to guess how old I am, you'll probably be able to figure out why. Secondly, I don't have a source for any of these tips. Unlike other videos where I actually do some basic research or at the very least critique something, I just opened up a Google Doc and started listing some game design stuff that I feel like more developers should know. So yeah, I can legitimately say that my source is that I made it up. Kinda. Obviously, my ideas have been influenced by countless game design videos made by other people, so I'm just gonna quickly credit these YouTube channels that I discovered a few years ago since they're what actually got me into game design. That's probably good enough. And finally, please take everything in this video with a grain of salt. These tips are supposed to be very general. It's impossible to make a mechanic that will work in every single game. Some things might heavily benefit one game, but completely ruin another, so make sure to use your own discretion to see whether or not they're applicable. Alright, time for the actual video now, go. 1. Minimize your heads-up display. A heads-up display is supposed to quickly give information to the player without interrupting the flow of gameplay, but the player only needs so much information. It should typically only include stuff like a health bar, level, stamina, etc. If the player can't just quickly look over at the HUD and get all the information they need in less than a second, then it's too complex. Take some of that useless information and put it on the inventory screen or something. Even better, you can make certain elements of the HUD only appear when they're relevant, like making the amount of money a player has only appear whenever they're in a shop or when they actually pick up more money. 2. Make your tutorial invisible. Obviously, you want new players to understand how your game works, so it can be tempting to just put a tutorial at the start of your game, but the beginning of the game is also one of the most important parts since it has to take on the monstrous task of getting players hooked. If the intro to your game is too boring, players won't feel like investing their time into playing the rest of the game, and lengthy tutorials don't help with this. The best tutorial is one that you don't even realize you're playing. Take Death's Door for example. It very briefly tells you how to use the controls and immediately throws you into a boss fight. The nice thing about this boss fight is that it's actually incredibly easy compared to the rest of the game, but still manages to teach you mechanics such as the ammo system, enemy health bars, and iframes on rolls. By doing this, the tutorial becomes the game itself, rather than just being something that a lot of players will skip if given the option. On a related note, 3. Always introduce new mechanics in a safe environment. It's really annoying to a player when they lose a lot of progress because of something they had no knowledge about. Whenever some new mechanic is introduced, don't punish the player for not understanding it immediately. Instead, make it so that they're free to experiment with it without fear of consequences. Once they get enough practice, they'll begin to fully understand the mechanic and it'll become like second nature to them. At that point, you can start raising the stakes again. 4. Don't overpatch things. Sometimes it's not a bug, it's a feature. Wait, before you yell at me, let me explain. Sometimes when you're making a game and you accidentally find a bug, rather than instantly patching it, you might be able to utilize it. For example, did you know that combos in Street Fighter 2 were originally a bug? Yep, you weren't originally supposed to be able to string attacks together, but the developers saw that you could and decided that since it was pretty fun to do, they touched it up a bit and left it in. Even if something is obviously a glitch that can't be turned into a mechanic, if players will never stumble upon it unless they're looking for it, there's no need to waste time patching it. Take Celeste for example. Did you know you can go through spikes that are set up in this specific orientation if you do a pixel perfect dash while in the crouching animation? Well, I can guarantee you that nobody who was playing casually ever found that out by accident, so instead of patching it in a later update, the developers embraced the glitch and created a hidden route in the DLC that saves like 4 seconds in a speedrun and can only be used by doing the trick 3 times in a row. In doing so, they managed to give something to the speedrunning community while simultaneously leaving the casual audience unaffected. 5. Don't add a run button. One of the most annoying things in games is when you have to choose between either holding down a button to run or moving slow. Now, that might not seem like a big deal, but after a couple of hours, it can start to get annoying, especially if it's not a run button, but a roll button. I love rolling as much as the next guy, but incentivizing the player to spam it outside of combat is less than ideal. Here's an idea: why not just make the default speed the running speed? If the player is gonna be running all the time anyways, then you may as well. If you really want the player to move slowly, then you can make it so that their movement speed automatically gets slowed down in areas like a town. You could also change the run button to a walk button, or at the very least, make the run button a toggle rather than something you have to constantly hold down. In my opinion, the only games that should have a run button are ones where running is an actually interesting mechanic, such as in stealth-based games, or in games with tile-based movement systems. 6. Avoid feature creep at all costs. Whenever you're thinking about adding a new mechanic to your game, you need to consider how much it improves the gameplay experience and how long it will take to implement. If something makes the game significantly more fun to play and only takes a day to program, then you should absolutely add it to your game. But if it's a small quality of life change that could take weeks to put in, then you might want to reconsider how you spend your time. But even if you're fine with delaying your game, you still don't always want to add more mechanics. The more mechanics that you add to your game, the more things the player has to learn. In most situations, the most complex part of your game should be the main gameplay loop, not some random side mechanic. A game like Forager actively benefits from the existence of a crafting system. The entire game revolves around collecting materials and expanding your island. Having various uses for each of those materials helps to make them all feel more valuable and distinct. Now imagine if that same crafting system was in Shovel Knight. Actually, on second thought, don't do that. Spare yourself some pain. Building on top of the last tip, 7. Refine the core mechanics to perfection. This should be incredibly obvious, yet I still see games make this mistake time and time again. The most important part of your game is the core gameplay loop. It's what the player will spend the majority of their time doing, and as such should be the best part of the game. The ending of Hollow Knight is great, but I only felt motivated to reach it because the rest of the game was also good. Genshin Impact has some legitimately interesting characters with unique side quests, but in order to get to them, I have to play Genshin Impact, and you know how I feel about that game. It doesn't matter how cool or deep the minigame you put in is, if players don't care about the actual game, then all of your effort goes to waste. 8. Things don't always have to make sense. It's a video game. Realism shouldn't be your priority. Look at the fishing in Spiritfarer. I know for a fact that there is no way that Stella is able to reel in the rod faster than the boat is moving, and that's completely ignoring the fact that the fish would also have to bite something moving that fast. But that's okay. It doesn't matter. It doesn't need to make sense as long as it's fun. If you're really that bothered about it, then you can also just make up a reason, like, oh, this fishing rod is magical since it's powered by the Everlight or something like that. 9. Use RNG very sparingly. RNG is one of those things that can either make or break your game, and it's incredibly important to properly utilize it. Some good usages for RNG can be for things like saving throws, cosmetics that don't affect gameplay, or anything really subtle like which attack an enemy throws out. Some bad usages for RNG can be for things like unavoidable negative events that are impossible to adapt to, item drops that are required to progress, or pretty much anything in a competitive multiplayer game. Human psychology is weird in that we tend to feel twice as bad losing something than we do feel good gaining something. That means that even if RNG causes something like giving the player a cool item, they'll probably still feel pretty bad if it also caused them to lose one, even if the item they lost wasn't even that good. If you're gonna add RNG, make it something that either the player can adapt to, or something that can only help the player. 10. Don't make punishments too harsh. Now, this is an entirely different story for multiplayer games, but for single-player games, the whole purpose of a feedback loop is to punish the player when they do something wrong so that they can try not to make the same mistake again later. However, if the punishment is too harsh, then they'll often focus on how bad the punishment was rather than how they can improve their own gameplay. The easiest way to mess this up is by making checkpoints too spaced out from each other, making it so that the player pays with their time if they make a mistake. Don't get me wrong, bosses with multiple phases are incredibly cool, but if they're not balanced properly, then they just become this cycle of getting through the incredibly easy and time-consuming first phase, dying on the stupidly difficult second phase, respawning at the checkpoint, and doing it all over again. If the difficulty is gonna spike that much, put a checkpoint in between. 11. Make full utilization of gimmicks. Even if it isn't one of the main mechanics of the game, if there is any kind of gimmick in your game, you should try to use it as much as you can. Braid is an excellent example of making good usage of gimmicks. Its main mechanic is that you can push a button to rewind time, but that's not what I'm going to talk about. Aside from the time travel gimmick that the game is based around, Braid also introduces some side gimmicks that are only present for a few levels in the game, such as a shadow character that repeats your actions or a ring that slows down time. Even though they're short-lived, each one of these gimmicks are utilized to their fullest, and none of them feel like they have any lost potential. And because they're all used in interesting and unique ways, once they're gone, the player thinks, that was really cool, instead of, that felt rushed and underdeveloped. You shouldn't rely too heavily on gimmicks, but if they're not developed enough, then they'll just feel like exactly what they are, gimmicks. 12. If you're making a multiplayer game, give players as many options as possible. I'm not just talking about cosmetics, although allowing for customization might not be a bad idea. I'm talking about actions that they can take, whether that be an incredibly risky play with little to no reward, stupid builds, or the ability to mess with your teammates. Multiplayer games are a lot more complex to design than single-player games because you also have to factor in the social aspect. Giving players the freedom to approach problems in different ways allows them to express themselves through their gameplay. This helps make each player feel distinct from one another and makes it feel like you're playing with an actual person instead of with a lifeless AI that always chooses the same options. 13. It's okay to withhold information from the player. Many mechanics, especially when it comes to enemy AIs, are best kept hidden from the player. If the player immediately knows how something works as soon as it's introduced, they're cheated out of the fun of learning through experimentation. Let the player figure out unique enemy weaknesses on their own, so that way it's all the more satisfying when they finally do. This doesn't just apply to enemies though. One of my favorite things that games do is giving players access to a mechanic from the beginning of the game without telling them about it. Going back to some of the first levels in Celeste and speeding through them after you've learned how to hyperdash grants uncomparable amounts of satisfaction. 14. Difficulty is about more than just changing some numbers. Imagine this scenario. You're making an endgame area and you want to make it a bit more difficult. How do you do that? Easy, just slap a couple more enemies in, increase their health bars and their damage, and bam, you're done. But this is just lazy game design. Yeah, there are situations where doing this is fine, such as if you're making a challenge mode, but to make difficulty feel less artificial, you need to add something new to the mix. Instead of just adding more enemies, how about you make it so that there's ice physics on the floor now, or the enemy has a new attack that you have to learn, or now you're on a time constraint. While stuff like this may take more effort to implement, it makes it so that difficult sections feel more unique, instead of just being the exact same thing as the easier section, except you're not allowed to make mistakes this time. And finally, 15. Break the rules. Despite what some YouTube videos may try to make you think, playing the same game over and over again can start to get boring for a lot of players. So, to change things up, you can make a section that completely alters a mechanic that the player already knows. This is usually best when it's a temporary change, since you don't want to make all of the skills that a player has learned irrelevant, but when done right, you can make an incredibly memorable segment of your game. Ideally, players will have to use the skills that they already have and apply them in new and unique ways, whether that be because of your dashes no longer regenerating when you touch the ground, having your health and mana bars get swapped, or some stuff that Inscription does that I'm not allowed to talk about. Alright, so that covers most of the things that I think are really important, but real quick I'm just gonna go through a lightning round of some more niche tips that need little to no elaboration. Always use icons instead of words when possible. Not only is it more visually appealing, but it's also much quicker to read. If you can't, do something like color coding words to make specific things more distinguishable. Consider adding a skip cutscene button. I know that this might just be my speedrunning bias, but also some players just don't care about the story. I have a friend who skipped every single cutscene in Celeste, and while that should be considered a crime, at least he got to enjoy the gameplay that it offers. If your game has a dog or other cute animal, give the player an option to pet them. It doesn't matter how short the animation is, or even if it's just a text box, let the player pet the animal. I guarantee you that no one will be mad that it's a feature. If you're able to name the main character and they're not supposed to represent a blank slate, give them a default name as well. It's nice when the community is able to refer to the character by name instead of just calling them the protagonist. If you're making a particularly scary section and you really want to set the mood, mess with the UI. You don't even have to break the fourth wall or anything. Simply adjusting some things that are normally familiar to the player can make them pretty uncomfortable. If you have branching paths in your story, give the player multiple save files. Having to go through the entire game again because you want a different ending can be really annoying. If you put a hard puzzle in a game that's not supposed to be a puzzle game, make it optional or allow the player to get hints if they want. Not everyone is gonna be smart enough to solve it. Give at least some warning to a player if they're about to cross a point of no return. It really sucks when the player finds something interesting that they want to check out later, only to find that they got permanently locked out of it when they return because they didn't do it soon enough. And perhaps the most important tip, don't overwork yourself. If you lose inspiration while working and just can't bring yourself to write another line of code, then don't. Step away from the computer for a little while and come back later when you're ready. You deserve a break. Probably, at least. Speaking of taking breaks, I've been talking for a while, so I'll just end this video with a cool fact. If you're watching this on PC, which you probably are given the subject of what I'm talking about, try clicking on this video and then push the home button on your keyboard. It should be the top middle in that group of 6 keys right above your arrow keys. Trust me, something really cool happens if you press it while watching a YouTube video. I promise that I'm not lying. I'm totally lying, it just restarts the video. Thanks for the extra watch time, bye!